It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's especially at the inaugural event of Khaled and the National Interest Foundation. Certainly, if you think of U.S. policy, following America's national interests makes some sense rather than conducting wars in the interests of other nations and their domestic allies, which it strikes me is what the Yemenis war is all about. It's very hard in my mind to find an American interest that justifies intervention, especially in a war that has such horrid humanitarian consequences. If you look at kind of the history of Yemen, I think one realizes there's a long history of conflict there, that this is not a fight that has suddenly emerged out of nothing. Indeed, kind of reading the history of Yemen is an extraordinary event. One thinks about its creation, at one point Egypt versus Saudi Arabia, becoming one country, the role of Saleh, who's been on almost every side. I think an extraordinary politician whose life just ended, of course. But someone who has battled the Houthis for many years is thrown out of office, and then this whole current conflict starts because he joins with the Houthis against his successor, which brings in the Saudis. That, in my mind, what we see here is a long-running civil conflict. There was not a sectarian conflict until Saudi Arabia got involved. That the country that turned this into a potential regional and sectarian war is Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, the prime movers of the coalition, as opposed to, the Houthis or the Iranians. And it strikes me that, what basically they want, and it makes sense from their own interest, I suppose, is essentially a puppet state next door. They want a pliable ruler as opposed to a rather disreputable set of rebels. And the challenge now is that may have been the original objective back in 2015, but it looks to me like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have diverging interests now. One sees the role of Saudi Arabia to the north and the role of UAE, especially the role of separatism, to the south. It's not clear that the major movers and shakers within the coalition themselves are now on the same page, which is resulting in an extraordinary fragmentation of a country that has always had separatist tendencies. But now, the factions, the militias, the groups allied here and there, is extraordinary. The U.S., as far as I can tell, the Obama administration thought the U.S. should go in and support the coalition, I think largely as payment for the Iran deal. The kind of irony would be if the U.S. walks out of the Iran deal, the U.S. will still be stuck with a war that it brought on to support a deal that the current administration no longer supports. And that, to me, would be a double tragedy then, getting rid of what I think has been an effective agreement as well as bringing on an unnecessary war along with it. The humanitarian consequences have been mentioned. Yemen was one of, if not the poorest nation on earth before this war. And what we see now is kind of horrid consequences, a majority of the population in extraordinary need. I find what we've seen, I think, with aid payments from Saudi Arabia and others is kind of a cheap grace. That one, bombs civilians and bombs Sana'a, destroys infrastructure and kills, and then provides some money to try to assuage the guilt. The problem here is America's participation. The U.S. can't control other countries in the region, but the U.S. is deeply, deeply involved, providing munitions, providing targeting assistance, and refueling Saudi planes. One cannot act as if the U.S. is not an active belligerent in a war. And I keep asking people, what have Yemenis ever done against America? Normally, one thinks of going to war to advance American interests and protect Americans. What on earth has happened out of Yemen that would warrant the United States killing people who've never, ever done anything, as far as I can tell, against the United States? And of course, beyond this, I think that one of the great tragedies of the conflict, beyond the people of Yemen, is intensifying regional sectarian conflict. What Saudi Arabia and the UAE have done is given Iran a very easy way to be involved and to bleed them. And quite honestly, if I was in Tehran, I would do the same, at relatively small cost, to try to make much greater problems for militaries that, at least the Saudi military, that's proved to be rather less effective than the regime, I think, had hoped. That what we see is, I've been particularly struck by complaints out of Riyadh, of missile attacks on Riyadh. My reaction is, well, who started this? If you spend 3 years bombing Sana'a, it's kind of hard to start whining because they shoot back. Again, a tragedy in my view, a spread of violence that serves no one. Nevertheless, the notion that somehow, the Saudi Arabian policy has nothing to do with this, I found quite extraordinary. I suppose that comes with the privilege of being royalty. The only policy, in my view, for the United States is to stop aiding and abetting, a policy that is murdering civilians for no obvious purpose, certainly for Americans. Now, in the recent debate about trying to stop American participation in war, a number of arguments were thrown out in terms of why the U.S. should stay involved. One was to help the legitimate government of Yemen. Well, I suppose President Hadi is legitimate. On the other hand, he's ruling from Riyadh, and as far as I can tell, is quite unpopular. Calling in airstrikes on your own people tends to do that. And indeed, not at all clear who within Yemen today supports him with this fragmentation. They're trying to find the factions and who could unify the country. It's not obvious that he can do that. Certainly no argument, in my view, that the Houthis pose a threat to the United States. They've never been interested in the U.S. They're not particularly pro-American. But if you look at the role in recent years of ongoing civil conflict in Yemen, their concern is Yemen, certainly not the United States. Some concerns have been expressed over the security of the Straits, but there's no evidence the Houthis have any interest in trying to close down the Straits, especially if the ports were open, which would serve them. That to the extent they take pot shots at American ships, it's because the U.S., they know, is aiding those who are shooting at them. The strongest argument that one gets, and certainly in the current climate with the administration, of course, is countering Iran. I think it's important to recognize that the Houthis and the Iranians have not historically been close allies. Number one, it's not accurate to call the Houthis a Shia militia in the same sense one views Iran as Shia. There are different variants that are very important, far beyond my capacity to understand. I have trouble enough keeping my fellow Protestant denominations straight, let alone trying to understand differences within Muslim theology. Nevertheless, the differences are significant. The notion that these are somehow two parts of the same is just simply not true. Clearly, this has been a long-running civil war. Iran's involvement over the years has been limited. Indeed, the word that I have heard is that they suggested that the Houthis not take Sana'a, urged much greater caution that the Houthis have their own agenda, have acted on their own. But the war, I think, has been indicated, has pushed them together. If you are part of the Houthis, where do you turn? You're under siege. You're fighting a government supplied by the United States, aided by the United States, helped by the United States. It's no surprise then to see them working together. Certainly, despite what the Crown Prince said, as much as I dislike the Iranian regime, to note that this is somehow Hitler, I think is kind of beyond silly. And what we have is a struggle going on in the Middle East that is a very important one. Unfortunately, this war is making it worse, not better. It's created yet another battleground. It exacerbates the conflict. It does not ease the conflict. Perhaps the most concern for the United States is the role of terrorism. The al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, other groups. But of course, these were groups which the Houthis were opposed to. But being busy fighting the Saudis, are not able to fight them. Hadi, in fact, at different times, the Hadi government has been willing to play with them. There's evidence that Saudi Arabian arms have gotten through to some of them. UAE has been tougher, I think, in the south in fighting QAP. Nevertheless, the civil war makes it easier as opposed to harder for the development of terrorism. Certainly recruitment, for AQAP and other things have been increased because of the conflict. So the U.S. on the side of supporting Saudi Arabia against the Houthis has had to actually ramp up very significantly airstrikes and also sending in special forces trying to fight AQAP. So the U.S. now kind of has a double-sided war going on where each one exacerbates the other. The strangest argument that I have heard is that, the U.S. needs to stay involved to help cut the casualties and end the war. Well, if the U.S. Objective is trying to cut the casualties, it's not doing a very good job. And indeed, the Pentagon admits that it does not track where Saudi bombers and strikes go after we've given them targeting information. The U.S. has no kind of data that tells it whether or not things are getting better or worse. That's not part of our job. America's job is to help the Saudis, not to track the impact on the other end. And it should be evident that if you subsidize a conflict, if you make it easier for a country to conduct a war, they are likely to do more rather than less. That the notion the U.S. should be complicit in the killing of civilians, complicit in the destruction of infrastructure in a desperately poor country, complicit in a blockade, complicit in what's, a country that's going through both diphtheria and cholera epidemics, in the name of trying to reduce casualties, I think, is Orwellian at best. As for ending the war, the U.S. hasn't gotten very far there, and I would say the same thing. The best way to put pressure on the kingdom as well as UAE to end the war is to stop subsidizing their efforts, rather. make them bear the full cost, as opposed to share those costs by Americans, American people, virtually none of whom anyway could even locate Yemen on a map. And there are other arguments thrown in. Of course, we wouldn't want to discourage allies. That one of my favorite was that the region might fall apart if we withdraw. It strikes me, if one looks at American policy in the Middle East, it has been the most destructive of any party. The U.S. cheerfully went in and blew up Iraq. The U.S. helped blow up Libya. And the U.S. wanted to take out and support a jihadist in Syria. The notion that America promotes stability and is concerned about holding a region together, I find amazing, amazing. Now, even if that was the case, explain to me how helping a country ravage a poor neighbor next door is promoting stability or helping anyone. The challenge here is, how do we bring peace? And this, I think, there's no easy answer, but the best answer would be for the U.S. to pull back and not to become a belligerent. If the U.S. wants to play a role as mediator, peacekeeper, promoter of something other than conflict, it would be better not to be actively involved, helping one side, bombing the other participant. The war is monstrous. It's hideous. I mean, all wars are. And we fool ourselves if we think that somehow there are kind of these honorable, wonderful conflicts that no one gets hurt in. But a conflict that's ravaging one of the poorest nations on earth, the consequences that we see are horrendous. And the U.S. is actively involved, in my view, in the deaths of civilians and the commission of war crimes. The only policy that is correct for the United States is to stop. Stop. And then let's talk about the policy moving forward. But the critical, the absolute necessity for America today is to back out of this conflict in which it has no interest to be involved. Thank you.